Eleanor kept her grandfather Wallace's study exactly as he'd left it 8 years ago, a shrine to a man the world believed had wandered off a boardwalk in the Ace Basin of South Carolina and was taken by the tide. She refused to accept he was gone without a trace, often sitting in his chair, trying to understand. The day the Park Service mails her a box of his effects, found tangled in marsh reeds during a cleanup, her hope flickers. Inside are his mud-caked binoculars, the leather strap stiff and cracked, one eyepiece shattered. It's amazing how a single, unexpected discovery can change everything we thought we knew about the past. If you've ever had a moment that completely shifted your perspective, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments below as we get into Eleanor's story. For 8 years, the silence in Wallace's study had been a heavy blanket. It smelled of old leather, paper, and the faint, sweet aroma of the pipe tobacco he'd quit a decade before his disappearance. For Eleanor, now a 28-year-old paralegal, this room was a time capsule of the man who had taught her how to read a compass and identify a painted bunting by its song. After he vanished, her grandmother Beatrice had wanted to clear the room out, to pack away the grief. But Eleanor had resisted. She argued it was a way to keep his memory alive, but the truth was, she couldn't let go of the case. A part of her believed the answer to his disappearance was somewhere within those 4 walls. The official story was simple and tragic. Wallace Coleman, a 68-year-old retiree, had driven to the Ace Basin National Wildlife Refuge for a morning of birdwatching. His car was found in the parking lot, his favorite birding hat on the passenger seat. The authorities concluded he'd likely slipped on a wet section of the boardwalk, hit his head, and fallen into the Combahee River, where the current and the alligators would have done the rest. No body was ever found. It was a neat, tidy explanation that satisfied everyone but the granddaughter who knew him best. Wallace was meticulous. He was a former investor who lived his life by calculating risk. He wasn't the type to take a careless step on a rickety plank. The arrival of the cardboard box felt like a disturbance in the quiet grief she had learned to manage. It was addressed to her grandmother, but Beatrice couldn't bear to open it. She'd passed it to Eleanor with trembling hands, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of pain. "You do it, dear," she had whispered. "You were always the strong one." So Eleanor sat at his old mahogany desk, the one with the ink stain he'd always tried to hide with a blotter, and slit the packing tape. The letter from the South Carolina Park Service was brief and bureaucratic, explaining that the items were found during a routine waterway cleanup. Inside, nestled in bubble wrap, were the binoculars. They were heavier than she remembered, caked in a layer of dried, dark mud. The leather strap was warped and brittle, and the right eyepiece was a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a single point of impact. It didn't look like the damage from a simple fall. It looked violent. She ran her thumb over the cracked lens, a cold feeling creeping up her spine. This was wrong, all of it. Her grandmother had found peace in acceptance, but Eleanor had only found a quiet, burning obsession. Holding this broken piece of his life, she felt that obsession ignite into a full-blown mission. She wasn't just holding his binoculars. She was holding the first real clue in 8 years. Her goal was no longer just to preserve his memory. It was to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. She took the binoculars to the small utility sink in the adjoining bathroom, a roll of paper towels, and a set of her grandfather's old watch repair tools. She was going to take them apart, piece by piece, if she had to. She spent the next hour carefully cleaning the binoculars, scraping away the dried mud and sediment with a dental pick. The salt water had corroded the metal casings, but the brand name, Zeiss, was still visible. They were his best pair, the ones he called his eyes on the world. As she worked on the central focus wheel, the large knob between the two eyepieces, she noticed something strange. It felt gritty when she turned it, and a little loose on its housing. Her grandfather was a fanatic about maintaining his equipment. A loose focus wheel wasn't something he would have tolerated. Using a tiny screwdriver from the kit, she found a small, almost invisible seam along the rubber grip of the wheel. It wasn't a factory seam. It looked like it had been carefully cut and resealed. Her heart began to pound. With gentle pressure, she pried the rubber grip off. Underneath, a section of the metal wheel had been expertly hollowed out. Tucked inside the tiny, custom-drilled compartment was a small, tightly sealed metal canister, no bigger than the tip of her pinky finger. Her hands shook as she worked it free. It was a film canister, but unlike any she had ever seen. It was impossibly small. What secret had her grandfather deemed so important that he would modify his most prized possession to hide it? The bird-watching trip was a lie. This was planned. He had gone to that boardwalk with a secret, and he never came back. She knew immediately she couldn't go to the police. They would take it, file it away in an evidence locker, and it would disappear into a bureaucratic black hole. This was her lead, and she had to follow it herself. She thought back through her grandfather's life, his friends, his associates. The name Arthur Pembroke came to mind. Arthur was a retired university archivist and a close friend of Wallace's. He collected old cameras and had a darkroom in his basement. If anyone could identify this tiny film, it was him. Finding Arthur's number in her grandfather's old address book felt like a conversation with a ghost. He sounded frail on the phone, but his voice warmed instantly when she mentioned Wallace's name. He agreed to see her that afternoon. Arthur Pembroke lived in a charming old house filled with books and the smell of developing chemicals. He was a kind man with gentle eyes, and he listened patiently as Eleanor explained her story, leaving out her suspicions and focusing only on the discovery of the canister. He took it from her and examined it under a magnifying lamp. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "This is microfilm, high-grade stuff, too, usually used for archiving sensitive documents, not for taking pictures of birds." He led her to his basement darkroom, a space filled with enlargers, trays, and the precise, orderly chaos of a master craftsman. He carefully unspooled the film and loaded it into a special projector. "Let's see what secret your grandfather was keeping," he said, flipping a switch. A bright rectangle of light appeared on the wall, and an image swam into focus. It wasn't a picture. It was a document, handwritten on legal paper. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she read the first line. It was a full confession. The text detailed a sophisticated investment fraud, a Ponzi scheme that had stolen millions from dozens of retirees across the Carolinas. And at the bottom of the page were two signatures. The first was Wallace Coleman's, as a witness. The second belonged to a man Eleanor knew all too well, Preston Thorne, her grandfather's former business partner and trusted friend. The date on the confession was October 12th, 2010, the day before her grandfather disappeared. Eleanor felt the floor drop out from under her. Preston Thorne. He had been a fixture in their lives. He and Wallace had built their investment firm from the ground up before Wallace retired. After the disappearance, Preston had been a pillar of support. He'd delivered a moving eulogy at the memorial service, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of his brother. He had even established a generous trust fund for Beatrice, explaining it was the least he could do to honor his partner's memory. The kindness, the support, the money. It was all a lie. Blood money. The confession laid out the scheme, but it ended with a contractual agreement. In exchange for Wallace's silence, Preston agreed to liquidate assets and repay every single investor in full over the next 6 months. Her grandfather hadn't been a part of the scheme. He had discovered it and was using his knowledge to force Preston to make things right. The bird-watching trip was a sham. It was the location for a secret meeting, a place where he likely went to receive the first payment or proof that the liquidation was in process. He had walked onto that boardwalk to do the right thing, armed with a confession on microfilm hidden in his binoculars as insurance. And he never walked off. The shattered eyepiece wasn't from a fall. It was from a fight. Preston hadn't come to make a deal. He had come to silence the only man who could expose him. Eleanor stood in the dim light of the dark room, the confession projected on the wall like a final, damning message from the grave. The grief she had carried for 8 years transformed into a cold, hard resolve. She now knew who the villain was. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. Preston Thorne was one of the most respected philanthropists in Charleston. He was untouchable. A piece of microfilm he could easily claim was a forgery wouldn't be enough. She needed more. She needed to make him confess. And she, a paralegal who spent her days buried in legal documents, would have to find a way to trap a killer. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she immediately dismissed it. Preston would have the best lawyers money could buy, and they would bury this single piece of evidence in motions and doubt. No, she had to be smarter. She had learned from her grandfather that the best way to win a fight was to use your opponent's strength against them. Preston's strength was his reputation, his carefully constructed image as a charitable, upstanding community leader. That's what she would attack. She spent the next 2 days in a fever of preparation, her legal training kicking in. She made high-resolution digital copies of the microfilm and mailed one on a thumb drive to a trusted former professor at her law school, along with a sealed letter explaining everything. She instructed him to deliver it to the state police if he didn't hear from her within 48 hours. That was her insurance policy. Then, she called Preston Thorne's office. His secretary was polite but firm. Mr. Thorne's schedule was booked for weeks. Eleanor calmly stated that she was Wallace Coleman's granddaughter and needed to discuss a private matter concerning the trust he had set up for her grandmother. The name worked like a magic key. The secretary's tone changed instantly. A meeting was arranged for the following afternoon in his top-floor office overlooking Charleston Harbor. Walking into Thorne Capital felt like entering the enemy's fortress. The lobby was all marble and glass, a monument to the money Preston had stolen. She was escorted to his office, a vast space with panoramic windows. Preston rose from behind a massive oak desk, his face a perfect mask of warm, paternal concern. He was exactly as she remembered him, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and a charismatic smile that could disarm anyone. "Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "It's so good to see you, my dear. Though I wish it were under better circumstances. How is your grandmother?" "She's as well as can be expected," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady. She sat in the leather chair opposite him, placing her handbag on her lap. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I was so sorry to hear the Park Service had dredged things up, so to speak," he said, his expression one of perfect sympathy. "It must be terribly difficult, reliving it all. It's been clarifying, actually. Eleanor said. She looked him directly in the eye. They sent us his binoculars. She watched him closely. For a fraction of a second, his smile faltered. A flicker of something cold and sharp passed through his eyes before being replaced by practiced sadness. Ah, yes, he loved those things. A shame they were broken. It is, she agreed. But it's amazing what things can survive after so long in the water. My grandfather was always so clever. He found a way to tuck things away for safekeeping in the most unusual places. She let the sentence hang in the air. She didn't mention the microfilm. She didn't mention the confession. She just let his mind fill in the blanks to picture what she might have found. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Preston's smile was gone now, replaced by a watchful stillness. "Safekeeping?" he asked, his voice a little tighter than before. "He was a meticulous man," Eleanor continued, her voice deceptively calm. "He believed in insurance, in making sure the truth had a way of coming out eventually." Preston leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. The mask of the friendly philanthropist was completely gone. In his place was the man from the confession, a cornered animal. "Eleanor, I think you might be overwrought. Grief can play tricks on the mind. Whatever you think you may have found, it's best left in the past." "I don't think so," she said. His demeanor changed again, shifting from false concern to condescension. "Let me be frank. Your family has been through enough. I set up that trust for Beatrice to provide her with security. Perhaps that security needs to be enhanced. A substantial sum to help you both move on and put this unfortunate business behind you for good. It was a bribe, a blatant, desperate offer. He was confirming everything without saying a word. My grandfather's life wasn't a business transaction, Preston," she said, her voice dropping. That's when the anger flared in his eyes. He stood up, his 6-foot frame towering over her. "You have no idea what you're meddling in," he hissed, his voice a low snarl. Wallace was a fool. He had a chance to be wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but his conscience got in the way. Don't you make the same mistake. It was the final piece she needed. She slowly reached into her handbag. Preston tensed, his eyes wide with alarm, but she didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out her phone and placed it on the desk, screen up. It was recording. "A full confession is better when it comes directly from the source," she said quietly. The color drained from Preston's face. He lunged across the desk, grabbing for the phone, but Eleanor was faster. She snatched it up and backed away toward the door. Just as his face contorted in rage, the heavy office doors swung open. 2 uniformed police officers, accompanied by a plainclothes detective, stepped into the room. The detective, a man Eleanor had spoken to through her professor, held up a warrant. "Preston Thorne," the detective said, his voice booming in the suddenly silent office. "You're under arrest for the murder of Wallace Coleman." It all came out during the interrogation. Faced with the microfilm, Eleanor's recording, and the testimony of several defrauded investors the police had quickly contacted, Preston Thorne confessed everything. Wallace had confronted him about the scheme, and in a moment of panic, Preston had agreed to pay everyone back. He wrote and signed the confession as a sign of good faith, believing he could manipulate his way out of it later. The meeting at the Ace Basin was supposed to be to discuss the repayment plan. But as he stood on that boardwalk, looking at the endless swamp, a darker solution presented itself. He could pay back millions and live in fear of exposure forever, or he could solve his problem permanently. He and Wallace argued. He pushed him. Wallace fell backward, his head striking the railing, and his binoculars hit the deck, shattering the lens. Preston, in a cold-blooded panic, rolled his old friend's unconscious body off the boardwalk and into the dark, swirling water below. 6 months later, the study was no longer a shrine. The air was lighter, and sunlight streamed through the clean windows. Eleanor and her grandmother Beatrice worked side by side, carefully wrapping Wallace's books and trinkets in tissue paper, placing them in boxes labeled memories. It wasn't a sad task. For the first time in 8 years, they were able to remember the man they loved without the suffocating weight of the unknown. They talked about his terrible jokes, his passion for the outdoors, and the way he'd hum off-key when he was happy. They held a new memorial service for him on the coast, not far from the Refuge. It wasn't a place of tragedy anymore. It was just a place of incredible natural beauty, the kind he had loved so much. Friends and family gathered, and this time they told stories of Wallace the hero, the man who gave his life trying to protect others. For Eleanor, the resolution wasn't just in seeing Preston Thorne sentenced to life in prison. The true peace came from this moment, from restoring her grandfather's legacy and finally giving him the ending his story deserved. She had found the truth he had left for her, tucked away in the heart of his most prized possession, waiting for the right person to come looking for it. Wallace took a huge risk by confronting a dangerous man alone, believing a piece of paper could protect him. Do you think he was brave for trying to force justice, or naive to think it would work without a bigger fight? Share your thoughts on this in the comments section. If this story gave you something to think about, perhaps you'll consider subscribing and joining our community for more narratives that explore the hidden truths around us. We appreciate your time and your attention.